Kia ora tātou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, welcome everybody to the panel discussion on the future of work. Whoa. Made me jump a little bit. There we go. Okay, I've disappeared again. Okay. So, this is a panel discussion that's been organised and supported by the Faculty of Arts. It's organised by Childhood and Youth Research Network and Social Futures Research Hub. And it's one of many events, I think, that will be running, particularly from the Social Futures Research Hub, looking at the issues of work, I would have thought. So I'll just introduce people to start with. We have a really distinguished and really interesting panel for today. We've just been having coffee, and I think the conversation is really interesting to get us starting. Get over here and let's take it into this room. So firstly, I'm Alan France. I'm Professor of Sociology at the Faculty of Arts. I've been kind of researching and working in the kind of youth field for a number of years, well over 25 years, and I've taken a real keen interest in the whole area about youth labour, the youth labour markets, education and citizenship. Been writing about that quite a bit recently, a recent book in 2016 about understanding youth in a great financial crisis, and then one more recently on youth and social class about enduring inequality in the UK, Australia and New Zealand. So I'm really kind of passionate about this subject area. I think it's a really important question for us to be thinking in New Zealand about future for young people in terms of work. So the panel today, in no particular order, I'll start with Nick here. Nick Green is a Principal Advisor with the Productivity Commission. He's based in Wellington. He's flew up today to be with us. He's a member of the Technological Change in the Future of Work Inquiry. He's previously worked on a range of projects, including using land for housing, better urban planning, state sector productivity inquiries. He's also worked on a joint project with Australian colleagues on growing up in the digital economy. And I believe his past life, he's worked in other government agencies, including Treasury, the Ministry, Foreign Affairs and Trade. The second is Judith here. Judith is a visiting professor here. She's here for a few days. She came yesterday, gave a talk. Her talk will go up on the big queue. And she comes from RMIT in Melbourne in Australia. She's a long and illustrious history of research and writing on youth-related issues. Her most recent publication, The Great Transformation, Politics, Labour and Learning in the Digital Age, is part of a series of works, I think, that she's been exploring how recent changes are disrupting links to income and human labour production and consumption. And she's written other books such as The Precarious Generation and A Criminalising Political Dissent. And in a similar sense, both those books, I think, continue that tradition. We then have Nikki Jones. Nikki is a senior consultant at the Martin Jenkins. She's an organisational professional with expertise in the future of work. She's a key role in advising and working with businesses on strategic alignment, strategic workforce planning and talent management. She has substantial experience and expertise in helping her clients, I think, anticipate and respond to changes in the future of work. She's also co-founder of the Future of Work Alliance Group in Auckland, and she has a wealth of experience, having also led the design and implementation of BNZ's talent strategy and as a leader of the leadership and talent team at the State Services Commission. And then on the end there we have Wendy Kerr, who is based here in the University of Auckland. She's director of the Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. She's an experienced general manager with global experience in technology and media startups. Wendy is the author of 2 best-selling books on female-led startups. My New Business, A Busy Woman's Guide to Startup Success. And I think the second one, Wendy, you'll tell me to start earning what you used to. So there are 2 books that she's produced, and she previously owned a web-based mentoring and training company for business owners. So as you can see, we've got a real combination here of people working in academia, people working with business, people working in research in this kind of field, which I think will give us a really interesting, diverse set of perspectives. So I'm going to hand over. I'll kind of let Nick speak first, as he's first in line. I'm going to ask you to hold the microphone, Nick, because that's the way that we can guarantee you're heard. I've asked all the speakers to talk for, say, 15 minutes. They've got some key kind of questions that they are kind of focusing on. It might just be worth saying a little bit of context, just to get us kind of going, what's brought me into this kind of subject in particular. So I've been kind of thinking about these issues for the 18 to 24-year-olds for quite a while, and I undertook this big kind of research kind of piece of work for my book, and I looked at 8 different countries about what was changing for young people, or what was the international patterns for young people in terms of work and education and the future. And there's a whole range of things that come out, but a number of them were that, firstly, we have now probably the best qualified and well-educated group of young people ever. I think OECD confirmed that's the case. They've really kind of embraced the knowledge economy requirements. There's been this kind of disruption to the labour market. There's then created significant insecurity, uncertainty, precariousness and underemployment. And evidence from around the globe then continually reinforces that idea was visioned as a future that the economy, in some sense, being built on high-skilled workers for the knowledge economy, would produce the types of jobs that the new educated groups that we've got of young people would be able to work and get into those kind of spaces and start taking up that kind of work. The reality is, and there's been a lot of debate about it, it's what's called the broken promise, that actually those jobs have not necessarily materialised in the way that it was thought they would, and that many of our young people are facing uncertainty about the future and how in some ways they're preparing, and if they're prepared now, right for the future. So I've kind of asked the panel to keep that in mind when we're thinking here and talking about future of work, about what it means for young people, what kind of things should they be doing, what kind of things are important, the types of skills, knowledges they should be having, because they need to know a little bit more about, is their investment the right type of investment? Are they doing the right kind of things to get into the future of future types of jobs that will pay them the kind of rewards that are necessary? So, anyway, on that point, I'll pass it over to Nick, and the floor is yours.
Bye. Just as an introduction, I'm from the Productivity Commission. For those of you who haven't heard of us, we're kind of a government think tank. We get given interesting issues to explore. We do lots of research and consultation with people, a bit of travel. And because we're not a ministry or a department, we can pretty much say what we like. So it's quite a nice sweet spot to be in. But one of the current projects we're working on is, as Alan said, an inquiry on technological change and the future of work. Thank you.
Okay.
So just go up and down?
Yeah, that'll just kind of move there.
Right, cool. I'll briefly go through what we were asked to do by the government, talk a little bit about some of our early findings about what we think is happening with technological progress and what it's doing to the labour market, and then briefly touch on some of our preliminary thinking about what this might mean for young people, particularly in the area of skills and education. We're still kind of working through things, so this latter section will be a bit rough and ready. We still haven't sort of landed our thinking, but you'll get the general gist. The first report is on our website. It looks like this. Not the most exciting cover, but hopefully quite a good read. The 2 key questions that the government asked us to answer are, what are the current and likely impacts of technological change and disruption on the future of the workforce, labour markets, productivity and well-being, and what can the government do to help people adjust to that? And they've asked us to do little bitsy reports on particular issues, one about technology in the labour market, which is the one that's out, one on employment law, things like how do you regulate the gig economy, is that an issue, one on education and skills, and then a wider sort of economic settings report. And our final advice goes to the government in March next year and will be published shortly after. Now, if you have read about the future of work or done a Google search on the future of work, you probably come across these kind of predictions that say that half of all jobs are going to be automated and mass unemployment is rife. It was started out by a couple of scholars, Carl Benedict Fry and Michael Osborne, the top one there, who suggested that 48% of jobs could be automated today. And there's been lots of variations of that that have been done around the world, including in New Zealand. So those 3 orange bars are the New Zealand relevant studies. You'll see that when it comes to New Zealand, anywhere between 20 and 50% potentially could be automated. And I suspect this is what has driven the government's concern and why they gave us the inquiry and why there's lots of other future of work kind of task forces around Wellington. But the more we dug into it, the more we really struggled to find any sense of disruption in the data. If there was big technologies crashing through the economy, you'd probably see some sign of that in some of the macro figures like unemployment, like productivity growth, like job churn, like business startup rates, like job tenure, and you really don't see any of that. Job tenure in most developed countries is at its longest period. People are staying in jobs longer. Business startup rates are down. Productivity growth is down. It's always been bad in New Zealand, but it's even worse than it has been for the past 30 years. And we've got some of the lowest unemployment we've had in, I think, 25 years, and you see similar patterns in the US. So at the high level, it's very hard to see any sort of sign of massive disruption coming, which kind of raises the question, well, why do people think this is imminent? Part of it will be micro stories. You'll see things around AI, you'll see chatbot and things in everyday technology. But we think there's two things that are explain the sort of lack of any obvious sign of disruption. I should go back and say, in case you don't believe me, this is productivity growth in America. You can kind of think of America as being the frontier economy, the place where technologies are created, where they sort of emerge first. And so if there was any big technological change, you'd probably see it here first, and you really don't. You go back to the 1950s, we had the post-Second World War period, very high productivity, sort of falls off, slight bump here with ICT, and then, so not a lot of sign. You can see very similar patterns in Australia, England, German, New Zealand data. It's all very common. The other thing which is quite striking is this graph, which talks about occupational churn, which is a very rough and ready way of saying new jobs being created, people moving between occupational classes. So based on American data, lots and lots of change at the start of the second industrial revolution, and around the sort of turn of the century, some peaks after the Second World War, and then not a lot. So this, of course, begs the question, well, what's going on? And we think there's probably two possible explanations. One is that if you look at those studies that say that all jobs can be automated or that lots of jobs are at risk, they only really look at one side of technology's effect on the labour market, which is, this one, robots replace jobs. In fact, technology does lots of things to labour, which both creates jobs, creates new jobs, and historically has meant that there's generally been enough jobs for all. So if you think about platforms that match people to work, that does that. It creates new jobs and services. It makes people more productive. Try doing any kind of maths out an Excel spreadsheet, and you remember how helpful technology is. It makes it easier to see how goods are being produced and their quality. It reduces the cost of things and increases the demand for those goods and services. But of course, it does also, in some circumstances, replace labour. The other longer-term story is, if you think about big technologies that have really changed the world, steam power, electricity, computers, they took a long time to flow through and to change economies. Take electricity. The first central electric power station in America, I think, was in New York, established in the 1890s, but it took another 40 years before half of all American factories were electrified. It takes a long time for technology to work through because people have to replace their existing machinery, they've got to reconfigure their businesses, they've got to train their staff. It may be that we are actually at a point where the technology is coming in, but people don't quite know how to apply it properly. And maybe in the future it will take off and we'll see the change to jobs and productivity that everyone expects will happen. What we did in this report was have a think about the various paths that technology could take. Most technology comes from overseas, so optimistically we could have a big boost and New Zealand could follow, probably a bit slower, but it could slow down, or it could have only a very brief boost, as was the case with ICT. We just don't know. So the key takeouts from this is there isn't really any obvious sign of massive disruption. If anything, it's probably more likely that things will just churn on as they've been going for the past 20 or 30 years, or they could kind of get slower and stagnate, which is not what we want. Even if things pick up, that doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be fewer jobs. If you look at historical examples, there has generally been lots and lots of jobs, albeit different jobs. And in the case of New Zealand, we actually want more technology. If you think about wanting to have more productivity, higher incomes and well-being, we're not actually very good at applying technology in this country, and particularly in our businesses. If we're serious about these objectives, we need to have more of it. So what might this mean for youth and young people? I think the key message is not to panic, at least not about work. Climate change, maybe. But what it does mean is that having a good educational foundation is probably more important than ever. Technological change and labour market change over the past 30 years has been what's called skill biased. So the more educated you are, the better off you've done in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of less risk of unemployment, in terms of incomes. And so giving yourself that insurance is probably more important now than it has been ever. And the individual and social costs of having little or no educational achievement are going to increase over time. There's probably reasons to be a little bit worried about New Zealand's progress on that front. This graph is average scores in PISA. PISA is an international standardised measure of educational achievement on various competencies, maths, science and reading. It's run across OECD countries. It's been in place since the 2000s. And these are New Zealand's average scores over time. And you see, at the start, we were one of the high achievers. Everyone thought we were crash hot. Things are not looking too good, and we have some of the worst gaps in performance by income and by ethnic group in the OECD. So there are kind of reasons to be concerned. At the tertiary level, we have high levels of participation, but if you dig down at the details, you'll find that Māori and Pacific students tend to be underrepresented at degree level and concentrated in lower level certificate and diploma level courses which have much less employment security and income opportunities. So there's reasons to be concerned about current settings and there's need to do something there. So I think in terms of where we're landing in our current work, in which we're coming out in our next two reports, there's a need for the tertiary system to be a bit more flexible, accessible and responsive. The way the current system works is it tends to advantages, well, the likes of me and my kids. You know, you do okay at school, you go into university, people kind of expect it and all is well. It doesn't serve non-traditional groups very well at all. And we need to start asking some questions about how well the school curriculum is being implemented. Anyone who's been near school recently will know that we have this supposedly world-leading curriculum which is supposed to give you transferable skills. It's supposed to be 21st century skills. There are very real questions about how well it does that, how well it's delivering opportunities, and an opportunity, I think, to make some changes and provide better opportunities, particularly for those who've been poorly served in the past. Anyway, that's me.
I was given 4 questions, I think really a 6. And so being an obedient person, I'll follow those questions. The first one is, what changes in work and work practices are we seeing? So I would say that to answer that question, we're seeing a couple of things, a few things. One is a diminishment in the number of jobs, and the other is a diminishment in the quality of jobs. Not always a diminishment, but certainly a change in the nature of work. As Nick said, in many areas that the people are talking about a loss of jobs from a third to a half. That's happening across the board in unskilled, semi-skilled and professional work. There's less demand for employment, but also it's augmenting work as well, and we can see that, for example, in medicine, in law, the way in which it's changing that, and also in academia. I think that it's important when we talk about what's happening with work, we've got to remember the context, and that is the social and the political context. And one of the things that's critical for the last few decades, certainly since the 1970s, is the major shift that we've seen in terms of the advent of neoliberal policy, of which New Zealand is famous for, because you're one of the sort of First Nations to sort of kickstart that. And that context matters because we saw with that the deregulation of the labour market, the privatisation, especially of public services, and that has really had a big impact on work and labour, and we must not forget that when we're talking about the future of work. Along with that, we've also seen unprecedented levels of social inequality, you know, and we cannot forget that either when we're talking about what's happening with work and the implications of that. As well as that, part of the context, we're seeing a change in the nature of capital. I talked about this a bit yesterday, in particular the financialisation. And in particular, what that means, you know, if we look, for example, at one new kind of capital, which is surveillance capital, that is capital that no longer requires workers. The other question around changes in work, I think as Nick said, we've seen an enormous sort of increase in new application of new technology, but paradoxically, we've not seen an increase in productivity or wages. And that's another change in work. But then again, and we talked about this yesterday a little bit, it means, what do we mean by productivity? What are we actually counting when we talk about productivity? That's a question perhaps that needs to be explored. And of course, the other thing is job insecurity, the precariat workers that are hitting, not just, unskilled workers, but also highly skilled workers as well. So the second question I was asked to talk about is, how can we imagine the future? An interesting and easy question, not really. And I would argue that how we can start thinking about the question is to begin by thinking about what we think now. We need to recognise how we see the world now, because it's really hard to think outside the concepts that lock us in to seeing the world. So we need to recognise the imaginary that we have at the moment. And I would say that we also need to think about what we actually value. Why do we work? What is the purpose of that action, that social action? What do we value and what do we need to realise that? If we're going to talk about what kind of future we need, then we need to ask those sort of questions. And we need, I think also, and I spoke about this yesterday too, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, we need to recognise the opportunity that we have now, because I would argue that we are going through a major period of transformation that is historic. And it's difficult to see the significance and the scale of that at the moment because we are actually part of it. The third question is how young people are being affected and what skills do they need now. And I would argue, and Alan touched on this today, one of the things that we do need to be mindful of, and I see it all the time because I work with young people, I work with students, not just the students, but their parents as well. They're really, really anxious. The students and young people, what will I do? The robots are going to take my job. I don't know. Their parents are investing money in their education, and so are they, by going into further and further debt. And I think we need to be careful about what some people call a broken promise or cruel optimism, to keep saying, yeah, go back to school, get another degree, just incur more debt. And I say, and blimey, I am an advocate of education. I think education is really, really important. But more education, people say, is the answer. I think not, because education's not the problem. What's the problem is the shrinkage of work and the demand for work. That's where the problem is. So I think also when we're told that the reason why we've got so many people unemployed, and again that category needs to be thought about critically, because people say, oh, unemployment's not that bad, but okay, how do you understand unemployment? What is that category? I usually like to talk about joblessness, because that includes all the people who actually don't have jobs, who want jobs but have given up working for them or do other things. So how many, we hear also people say, well, and this is not a new thing either, it happened in the 1930s and the 1890s when we had economic crises. The way in which we can fix the crisis is by reforming education, making sure that we have graduates come out with the right skills. And we need education that needs to be responsive to business, more entrepreneurs, that'll kickstart the economy and everything will be wonderful. Well, I think we do need to think about education, but because the way in which we educate, primarily it's education designed for an industrial order or an order, capitalist order, that's no longer as relevant as it is. So it's not education to blame. We need to think about, it's not the supply, it's the demand of jobs. And if we actually want full-time work, which is another question. The fourth question I've been asked to Oh, the other part of that is what skills do young people need? And we talked about this a little bit before. I think we do need to be careful about trying to read the future, because we can't say our young people need those skills to be, you know, techies in this area or that area. I would say that one of the fundamental skills that young people have, and I try my hardest to make sure I do this with my own students and the young people I spend time with, is to encourage them to do and be and think about what we're really missing now. Skills in leadership. That's what we need. We need to be teaching young people, not because there are, if you have a look around, the leadership that's being exhibited by young people now is significant and I think important. But one of the things we really need to do is teach young people about how to be good leaders. What does that mean? How to think. Sounds easy, it's not. How to think well, how to make judgment, the moral emotions that go with that, having courage, seeing it through, your ideas, how to be working collaboratively, collectively, democratically, and most importantly, critical thinking. How to work out what's going on and how to work with people to imagine a future and work collectively to achieve that. I would say that's one of the most fundamental skills that I think young people should be encouraged to develop. And I think too, young people have got a lot to teach us older people about that as well. Now, the last question is, will there be work for all? And how do we ensure a fair distribution? Okay, will there be work for all? You know, that's a political question. And we have, it depends on our political leaders, our captains of business, the state, whether or not they've got a commitment to creating work, whether it be full-time, part-time. It's something we've had historically. We've always had a commitment, at least in Australia, New Zealand, United States and England, a commitment to full-time work. But the governments gave that away in the 1970s. And that's another story. You know, is there a commitment to full-time work and the creation of full-time work on the part of government? That will determine whether or not there'll be work. And that raises the question of the work ethic. Why do we work? What's the purpose of working? To be a virtuous person, to get income. And we also need to ask that question about work and full-time work and whether or not we should be creating it in the context of what is happening now in terms of climate change. All right? If we're going to create full-time work, great. Let's think about work that might help mitigate that problem that we have, that we all have. Some people proposing that now with ideas around the new Green Deal, for example. We could create wonderful opportunities, meaningful work. You know, David Graeber, the anthropologist in England, talks about all the work that we've created, and he calls it a not very nice word, bullshit work. That is work that's made up just to keep people busy to make sure that, you know, they get an income, etc., etc. We've got to make sure that we don't create those kinds of jobs that are demeaning. Now, the last part of that question is how do we ensure a fair distribution of social goods, resources, number of ways, and I'll just say some of those. One, and people are talking about that now, which is guaranteed adequate income, and the idea of that. It's being pushed and experimented in a number of countries now. And what that means is that we do have the means to produce the goods to make sure everybody has a decent life. And if we do that, then people can have houses to live in, can do work that they want to do that's not normally valued as work, like looking after children, for example, or elderly, for example. And the other way in which we can help ensure a fair distribution of work is by looking at tax reform. And that's a huge question. And again, there needs to be the political will to do that. So just off the top of my head there, the way in which I would respond to those 4 questions. Thank you.
So as Alan said in the introduction, my role has been working in sort of HR strategy in a number of different organisations, and so my perspectives come much more from just what I've experienced rather than less of an academic sort of focus. So just to sort of show the difference there, it's the work I do now is I am working for a consultancy, so I work with a range of different organisations, but prior to that I was embedded in a number of different places. So immediately previous to where I am now, I was in a bank, so much more of a corporate in an area that has actually got a lot of technology and change happening at the moment. And prior to that, within the public sector, so in a range of different disciplines. So I'll kind of sort of move between observations from different jobs to try and bring together some of the answers to the questions we had. So one of the pieces of work that I've been involved in recently was to support ATEED, which is our economic development agency in Auckland. And that asked us to look at the impact of technology on Auckland and what does that mean for the workforce, and in particular within South and West Auckland, where there's some challenges at the moment around good employment opportunities for people. And the first thing that we did is we looked at, well, what's actually driving this? And a lot of it was around some of the stats from Fry and Osborne that Nick talked about. They've said that there was 270,000 jobs in Auckland that could be automated. And the question was sort of, well, what does that mean for Auckland then? If 270,000 jobs go, what does that mean for us? And what I did is along with looking at a lot of forecasts and things, we also talked to a lot of businesses around Auckland. And one of the things we discovered is, while that is possible, and there's nothing in Fray and Osborne's model that isn't possible, the model is that they look at technology that is currently available, but what they don't look at is saying a particular time frame of looking at adoption. So it's assuming that if technology is currently available, it has been adopted, and therefore these are the tasks or the roles that can be replaced. What we found, though, is really different. So a lot of organisations aren't adopting technology at the rate that's possible. So while we hear scary stories, actually it's not that different from how it was 5, 10, 15 years ago in a lot of New Zealand businesses. So yes, it's scary, all the headlines, but actually it's not an immediate need for us at the moment to be thinking about that change. So what we found is that there was a number of reasons for that. Key one was that people didn't even know what was available to them. So New Zealand has a lot of small to medium enterprises. So while we have some large businesses which we talk to, we've also got a lot of SME owners. And they're really busy working in the business. They don't necessarily have time or the skills to actually step outside and understand what's available to them. So there's just like a lack of knowledge there. The other thing is that actually the cost of plant and buying new technology is really expensive, and many work on a 10 to 12 year cycle for that. So while technology is available now, many organisations can't afford to actually to purchase it and to implement it currently. And then the last finding that we found, which was really, and I found interesting and very different from what I expected, was that actually a lot of it is that we are really focused on our people. We care about our people. And we heard things like, well, why would I do that when Bob does such a good job at that at the moment? Why would I automate it? You know, when Bob retires, then I'll look to do something different. So there's a number of things that are getting in the way for organisations. So while we can think about what do we need to be doing to prepare for the future, one of the things we need to be thinking about is how do we make it really accessible and easy for businesses to actually to adapt and adopt to some of the technology that's available. So that's something we can think about. What we did find, though, is that some organisations are doing it really well. So it's not that nothing's happening in New Zealand or in Auckland, it's just that it's not happening as quickly as we thought. And so we do know that actually within some organisations, and banking was one where I came from, we were looking a lot around what are the things that we can automate. So we weren't necessarily automating complete jobs, but there were tasks within people's jobs that we were looking to automate. So credit decisioning, for instance, for tellers or for our business bankers. So we were thinking about, okay, so what are the things, the tasks that can be taken away from people, and how can that make the people that we have, I guess they have a higher level of skills needed to do the work that is then remaining. The other thing we're looking at is around how do you augment. So technology isn't just always about replacement, and that's the Fray and Osborne stuff looks at how you replace, but actually how do you augment the work that you've got, the people that you've got. So that's about how do you make them using big data so that they have better information available to them, to have higher quality conversations, to add more value to the customers, those sorts of things. So there are some changes that are going on. What we do know, though, is that as tasks or jobs are replaced by technology, it doesn't necessarily mean that new jobs aren't created. And Nick also mentioned that, and history has said that actually as technology is implemented, more jobs will be created. The challenge is that there are different skill sets that are going to be needed for people to be in those jobs. And so that's where I think we can spend more time thinking about, is about what are the skill sets that we're going to need in order to be effective in the future, because it's not necessarily that the jobs are going to go. When we spoke to a lot of organisations, there was two sets of skills that they were talking about. One was very generic, and regardless of role, of level, of industry, anything that they're talking about, there were some skills that they saw as being important. And they were things like growth mindset and curiosity, so the openness to learning new things, to recognising that you're not an expert and you don't know it all already, and actually you can learn from what's going on around you. There were some of those sort of uniquely human ones like empathy and collaboration and some of those things that currently technology doesn't do or doesn't do well, and whether it does in the future or not, who knows, but actually these are the things that make us who we are. So in the case of, say, our bankers who had a lot of the work taken from them and automated, actually being able to connect with customers and have those conversations, especially in times of challenging financial situation for them, was really important. There's the stuff that Judith talked about, so critical thinking. So actually being able to take some information and really work out, so how do you come up with what is the right answer to this? Because it's not necessarily the answer that you had last time. As everything around us changes, we can't rely on the fact that if it's worked once, it will work again. We need to be able to be really thinking about, how do we make sense of the changing world around us? And then we also found some skills around resilience, so grit and resilience. Things aren't going to be easy, and you're going to fail sometimes because you're going to try to do something and you're going to try and do it the same way you did it last time and it's not going to work, or things around us change, and we've got to just learn to bounce back and really, have that persistence. So they're the sort of generic skills that everybody needs to have, and I think that's something that we need to think about, how are we supporting our people to develop those? More so than some of the sort of technical skill sets. So currently the education system deals really well with some of the technical skill sets. What we need to be thinking about is also how are we learning some of the transferable things, because as technology changes, the technical things are going to change. So doing an accounting degree, a lot of that will be automated. Doing a legal degree, a lot of that will be automated in the future. But actually it's not to say that there's not roles in those areas, it's just actually the roles will require different skill sets. So that's something to think about. There were some other ones that were skill sets that were required for just specific roles, but they were needed in a lot of organisations. So data and analytics, we're collecting a lot of data. Actually, how do you make sense of that, and how do you use that data to actually be useful for you in your organisation? So having skill sets around that is really important. Things like human-centred design, so if we're looking at a more customer-centred approach and things, how do you actually do things in a different way? So human-centred design skills are really important. So there's a few niche sort of areas there that people can be thinking about for themselves as well. And one of the really interesting things that came through was the idea of employability skills. So this is something that a lot of organisations said, this is what we're lacking. We've got some really smart people, but they don't understand the importance of, you're turning up to work on time, regularly, every day, in some areas drug-free, of asking questions, of being open to work, some of those things. And so when we're looking at sort of the education system, and there we're thinking a lot about the school system rather than the tertiary, is actually how are we supporting our people to really understand what the world of work is all about. At the moment, education and business seems to be quite separate, and they're not necessarily working really closely together, and I think that's something that we can be looking at in the future around how do we work more closely together to really deliver what the skills that are going to be life skills that are going to be important in the future, and less focus on the periodic table and some of the other things that actually we probably aren't going to need as much of. So there's a number of things that you guys can be thinking about, both from your positions as individuals, as well as the roles that you play either in academia or in organisations or in government. For individuals, it's about being really open to upskilling, of assuming that the education you receive when you're leaving school and you're in tertiary education, that's not going to be the education that keeps you going for the rest of your life. I don't know if you've heard of the 100-Year Life, which is a model that Linda Grattan and I think Andrew Smith it was from the London School of Economics talked about, the idea that if we live longer, and actually as things around us change, we've got to get out of this three-phase life of education, working and then retirement. and really think of the opportunities to re-educate ourselves as a frequent thing that we'll be doing throughout our lives. We'll have moments of maybe not retirement, but rest in between. We're not necessarily going to be doing it in those 3 phases, because what you learn in your 20s isn't going to last you for the next 40 or 50 years that you need to be working. And we can't afford to retire at 65 and live till 100 because we're just not saving enough money. So thinking about that sort of differently and being really open to upskilling and learning new things and taking different track and not thinking I studied this, therefore this is where I'm going to be working in for the rest of my life. Education, some of the stuff we can be doing is actually making sure that we're putting enough focus on the right set of skills. So not just the technical skills, they are still important, but they're not going to be the thing that actually continues people through for a long time. So how do you make sure you really are focusing on, developing critical thinking and empathy and collaboration and some of those other things that you need to use in the world. And then the other thing is around, there's a lot that government can be doing about how we're incentivising and making education more accessible for people so that they can learn into their adulthood, that it's not something that they need to necessarily give up work in order to do so, because we all know not everyone can afford to do that. So there's a lot of things we can be doing, but it's actually focusing on some of those transferable skills are going to be the thing that actually is, that we can take control of ourselves, that regardless of what the future looks like, we know that those are going to be important.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As you know, I am the Director for the Centre of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Auckland University. And we're run out of the business school, but we are for every staff and every student at this university, irrespective of the discipline or the faculty that they work within. And this is a really important point, because I think it's the interdisciplinarity and it's the collaboration and the collision of different mindsets, different backgrounds, different skill sets that really represent to me what the future of work is all about. So I'm going to answer the 4 questions with a slightly different lens. I'm going to talk about the future of work being the future of entrepreneurship. And the future of entrepreneurship, in my mind, is also the future of education. So the context in which we are heading into, my panellists have spoken to, we are in the 4th Industrial Revolution. This is meaning that we are going to see change and disruption like we have not seen before. The World Economic Forum defines the 4th Industrial Revolution as a blurring of technologies, and it's a fusion of technologies that are very different, and they come to different and new and novel ways to solve problems. So, for instance, you might get a company that has artificial intelligence researchers, psychologists, copywriters, artists, business people, all working together on how do we improve the interface between humans and machines. And in fact, we have such a company like that in Auckland now, and it was one of the Auckland University's spin-outs in artificial intelligence, and that is Soul Machines. And they are creating digital humans to really work with us in a different way. And I do not believe that they will replace jobs, but really they're going to augment a lot of jobs that already exist within organisations, and I think we've heard examples of that already. The other thing that the 4th Industrial Revolution is going to do is it's going to change the paradigm of an organisation. So instead of an organisation being like a machine, which is very bureaucratic, it has a top-down hierarchy, silos, and very rigid ways of working, which served us well in the 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd industrial revolutions, when we moved from the field to the factory, from making products to processing information. In the 4th industrial revolution, McKinsey is saying that the company is going to move to be much more like an organism. So it's going to shrink and expand depending on what problem it is facing at that moment. And it's going to bring in a raft of different experts, freelancers, and partner with different types of organisations from all of these different types of technologies, depending on what they need to solve there and then, what the demands of their customers are, what the competitors are doing, where they see the future going. Now, the thing with this type of working and going into an organism state that's very fluid and it's very dynamic is that these companies will not produce jobs for life. They won't even produce jobs for 10 years. When that job is done, the problem is solved, so is the expert, so is that freelancer. Their time is over with that organisation. So when you think about the way in which the organisation will be working, that is going to create a new workplace economy. And that workplace economy will be the gig economy. And if you think about the gig economy, it's going to mean that all of us will have discrete pieces of work for specified periods of time to solve defined problems. And we'll come together with a range of diverse people who we may or may not have met before to solve this problem for an organisation, and then we'll disband when that's done. So what this means that we are going to have to be very multidimensional in how we approach our career, how we approach marketing ourselves, how we approach our skills acquisition and our experience acquisition. So no longer can we just assume that whatever we study in, we will then do for the next 25 or 30 years. And what that starts to do is it starts to put under pressure the value of an undergraduate degree. And therefore, I think that the undergrad degree is not serving undergrads as well as it used to, particularly when I graduated. When I studied marketing, got a Bachelor of Commerce, first job out, I was marketing Colgate toothpaste and toothbrushes, and so on and so forth, my marketing career went on. So what we find in this new way of working and in this new economy is it requires new skills. And so the World Bank did a report recently, and they say that these 4 skills are essential for this new way of working. The first skill they talk about is cognitive flexibility. And what that means is how do you solve problems critically, and then how do you assess information and solutions critically? The second skill they talk about is emotional intelligence. So if you think about these organisations bringing together experts, freelancers, very dynamic, shrinking and expanding, your ability to be able to work in teams with people you've never met before, who are very different to you, who do not share your background nor your values, is essential. Emotional intelligence will allow you to engage and to inspire and empower others that you're working with. The third skill they talk about is socio-behavioural skills, which is a very fancy way of being able to work in teams well. So again, this is about having a common approach to problem solving, being able to appreciate others' diversity, harness conflict in a positive way, and work towards a shared outcome. The last skill they talk about is adaptability. And if you think about the change that we've experienced and that we know is coming, then the ability to be able to adapt and to see opportunities in this change as opposed to be fearful and see problems is going to help you build resilience, but also make you much more marketable over time. And this is why I think the future of work is the future of entrepreneurship, because all of us are going to have to be our own businesses. In a gig economy, we are selling ourselves. We are our brand, we are our product, we are our service. And that requires a very different mindset and approach to how you market yourself, acquire skills, and deal with people than what it would be if you were thinking that you would have the same career or even the same job for a decade or more. The thing that we have noticed at the Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship is that over the last 4 years, we have grown by 370%. When I started in 2015, we had 800 students involved in our programs, and I was on a mission to see how we could increase the number of students engaged. So I went around the campus doing a bit of human-centred design with my clipboard, and I asked many, many students, what did they think of innovation and entrepreneurship? And if I'm honest, what I discovered was really surprising, because I got a lot of students saying to me, why would I need to know about innovation and entrepreneurship? When I finish my degree, I'm going to get a job. I have no intention to start a business, so these concepts are irrelevant to me. 4 years on, as I said, we've grown by 370%. So this year we'll have over 3,000 individual students in our extracurricular programs. So they do these in their spare time. So what's changed? And I think all of us have spoken about what's changed. The environment in which these students are graduating in is changing dramatically. There is a massive realization amongst these students that a degree is not enough to help them stand out anymore. they're starting to realise that they may not get that job that they think they deserve. So they're now looking for skills that help them be more work ready, their workability skills. Because when you're learning about innovation and you're learning about entrepreneurship in a very experiential way, you learn how to take risks, you learn how to solve problems, you learn how to work in teams, you learn how to pitch your ideas, and importantly, you learn how to fail and how to learn from that. So when I think about our increase in the number of students we've had in our programs, I think that is the best thing that we can do at the university as our duty of care of preparing these young people for the uncertain future ahead. So in closing, I'd just like to say that I think it is an exciting time, and I get really frustrated by people who think about this change as something to be fearful. I see it that if you take this on as a challenge and see the opportunity for what it is, then really you can create your future to be anything that you want it to be.